The movie begins in 1984 at a gun show where a young guy named Rick Wershey Jr. is checking out some AK-47s. He's discussing the price with the seller and quickly realizes that the guns are actually from Egypt, not Russia, as the seller is claiming. Rick brings over his dad, Richard, to confirm. Richard accuses the seller of trying to trick a kid who knows his stuff. With that, they manage to get the seller to agree to a big discount, warning him that if he doesn't, they could report him and he might lose his license. Afterward, they head back to their car. Rick asks his dad why they're sticking around since he's always saying the city isn't good. Richard replies that he has a good feeling about this year and points out a VCR in the back of the car, explaining that they're going to open a video store together. When they return home to Detroit, they spot a car parked in their driveway. Both Rick and his dad recognize it as belonging to Ty. Richard grabs an AK-47 and rushes inside, where he finds Rick's older sister Dawn making out with Ty. Immediately, Richard suspects Dawn is on something and tells Ty to leave. Dawn runs after him down the street, but Ty drives away without her. Their grandparents arrive just as the chaos unfolds. Dawn yells at her father, and Richard tries to explain to his parents. Furious, Dawn storms back inside, and Richard tells her to get dressed so they can go out for ice cream to cool off. That night, while working on silencing devices for the AK-47s, Richard talks to Rick about upselling. Rick quickly understands and uses the tactic to sell the guns, making extra money and earning respect from gang leader Johnny Curry. The next morning, Dawn wakes Rick, telling him she's leaving and gives him a number, warning him not to tell their dad. Rick realizes she's going to Ty's and tries to stop her, but she brushes him off, saying their dad is no better. Richard watches as she leaves with Ty. The next day, Rick successfully sells the guns with silencers to the gang members. Later that night, Rick met up with his friend Boo for a skating event, and they had a great time. The next morning, Rick woke up to FBI agents Alexandra and Frank talking to his father, accusing him of illegal gun distribution. They called Rick over, aware of the silencers, and warned they'd catch Richard eventually. They asked Rick about the gang, but later that day, Rick spent time with the gang. While messing around, they spotted some rats and shot at them, laughing the whole time. That evening, Rick was heating home with a stuffed duck he had bought for his sister. Suddenly, a car pulled up next to him, and inside were FBI agents Alexandra, Frank, and another officer named Jackson. They offered him a ride and grabbed some takeout on the way. While driving, they questioned him and showed him a photo of a dead man, explaining the man had been killed with a gun from a licensed dealer. They insisted Rick's dad wasn't the real criminal, but his clients were, and they were only trying to help. The agents gave Rick a task: buy drugs from local dealers to help gather evidence. They promised $200 in return. As Rick prepared to take his gun, they confiscated it, reminding him he couldn't carry firearms for this. Rick followed through, bought the drugs, and handed them to the agents. After they dropped him home, he found his dad asleep on the couch and quietly went to his room to stash the money. The next day, Rick was with the gang, helping them choose suits for Johnny Curry's wedding to Kathy, the mayor's niece. Curry asked about Boo, and Rick reassured him that Boo was his best friend and would never betray him. Curry, showing respect, invited Rick to try on a suit, hinting at an invitation to the wedding. When Richard saw Rick trying on the suit at home, he asked where he was going. After learning it was for the mayor's niece's wedding, they realized it would be at the mayor's house. At the wedding, Rick spotted a man talking with Curry. Boo told him it was Art Derrick, a major drug dealer from Miami. They greeted him, and the bride complimented Rick, saying he looked sharp. On the way back from the wedding, Rick and his friends, Noog, Boo, Freaky Stevie, and Ed, ran into some girls from school. Rick invited Brenda Moore, his crush, to join them. They all headed to a drive-in theater, where Rick sat with Brenda. They talked about the wedding and their families, eventually sharing a kiss. The next day, Rick met with the FBI, who gave him drugs worth around $4,000. Nervous about his father finding out, Rick hesitated, but when the agents promised he could keep the money from the sales, he agreed and sold the drugs with Boo and the gang. One day, Richard saw Rick in a car with the agents and grew suspicious. He searched Rick's room and found the hidden money. When Rick came home, his father angrily confronted him, demanding to know how he'd earned $9,000. When Rick tried to explain, Richard, furious, slapped him. Upset, Rick stormed off to his room. That night, Rick took his grandfather's car and met Dawn at a diner, giving her the stuffed duck he had bought for her. He noticed Dawn didn't look well and asked her to come home, but before they could talk more, someone stole the car. Both Rick and Dawn chased the thief, firing at the car. The police arrived and arrested them both. Later, the FBI agents informed Rick of the charges, but assured him they would likely be dropped, as they would make sure the arresting officer wouldn't appear in court. Rick took responsibility for the gun, and Dawn was released. Sometime later, Rick spoke with Curry, who revealed he knew Rick had been selling drugs without permission. Curry warned him to stay away from his territory, but offered Rick a deal. He could keep selling drugs if he was honest, and gave Curry his usual cut. Rick traveled to Las Vegas for a big boxing match. Curry said that Leon, a customer, had arranged ringside seats for them. However, when they arrived, they were denied entry because Leon had given the tickets to a rival gang leader. At the after-party, the rival gang leader flaunted his success, which infuriated Curry. In a rage, Curry attacked and killed him with a champagne bottle. When Rick and the gang returned from Vegas, Curry ordered 2 of his men to go to Leon's house and kill him as payback. But when they arrived, Leon had already fled. In frustration, the gang members shot at the house from the outside. Tragically, one of Leon's young nephews was struck and killed by a stray bullet. The shooting became a major story, especially when it was reported that the boy who was killed had been shot with an AK-47. Feeling uneasy, Rick went down to the basement to search for a gun, knowing his grandfather had hidden them. Richard heard the noise and came down to find Rick. They had a brief conversation, with Richard expressing his disappointment about the people Rick had been associating with lately. Meanwhile, Curry received a phone call from his father-in-law, warning him that if the authorities found out about any AK-47s linked to him, there wouldn't be any way to protect him. The police were already cracking down on anyone possessing those weapons. After the call, Curry gathered his gang, including Rick, and told them they had to be extra cautious from now on. He made it clear he'd do whatever it took to stay out of jail. Later, as Rick was heading home, the FBI agents caught up with him, but Rick refused to talk and took off. The next morning, Rick saw his father loading AK-47s into the car. When Rick asked why, Richard explained that he had to get rid of them quickly. Rick mentioned that he planned to go back to school, and Richard told him that he had received a goldfish as a gift from a customer. About an hour later, Rick's friend and fellow gang member, Nug, stopped by. While Rick was getting him a drink, Nug suddenly apologized and, without warning, shot Rick in the stomach before fleeing. Richard rushed to the hospital, visibly shaken, as Rick underwent a long surgery. Unable to process his emotions, Richard left the hospital and drove to Curry's house. He spotted Boo outside and even prepared his gun, but in the end, he couldn't bring himself to shoot anyone. When Rick woke up in the hospital, his sister Dawn was there, concerned and asking what he had gotten himself into. She told him he had been listed as John Doe in the hospital. Later, Alexandra, one of the FBI agents, visited Rick in the hospital. She asked him who shot him, but Rick refused to give her any information. She then revealed that thanks to Rick's help, they had managed to arrest Curry and most of the gang. As a result, the FBI had decided to overlook Richard's involvement in selling illegal guns. After Rick was discharged from the hospital, he and Richard were driving home together, talking once again about their dream of opening a video store. Rick expressed his desire to leave town, saying that nothing good ever seemed to happen there. Back home, Richard told Rick that going back to school wasn't an option anymore. Because he had been shot and was involved with dangerous people, the school saw him as a potential threat to the other students. In 1986, a young boy approached Rick and revealed that he was Brenda's brother, and Brenda had recently given birth to Rick's child. Later, Rick went to see Brenda and met his daughter, who was about 6 weeks old. Brenda's brother also brought Richard in, and both Rick and his father held the baby. On the drive back, Richard brought up the idea of opening the video shop again, but Rick seemed doubtful it would ever happen. He asked his dad if going back to selling drugs could improve their lives, believing it was their only way out. They argued heatedly and got so distracted that they nearly crashed the car, but thankfully avoided an accident. The argument continued, with Richard initially refusing the idea of Rick selling drugs again. However, after some time, Richard reluctantly gave in, and Rick returned to dealing on the streets, quickly making a lot of money. Not long after, Rick and Richard went to a house where drugs were being used, and they found Dawn asleep in one of the rooms. Rick insisted they were taking her home, but Dawn resisted, causing a scene. Once home, they confined Dawn to her room in an effort to help her overcome her addiction. She screamed and banged on the door, desperate to get out, but they ignored her cries. The withdrawal symptoms made her irritable and aggressive, but after some time, she began to improve. Richard eventually brought a TV into her room to help her through the recovery. By 1987, Rick had made enough money to make his father's dream of opening a video store a reality. Richard finally opened the store, and the family gathered to celebrate the success, toasting to their long-awaited dream coming true. Later, Rick crossed paths with Curry's wife, Kathy, at a skating rink. They spent time together, eventually going back to her place. Kathy confided in Rick, expressing her frustrations with Curry. She believed that if Curry had only trusted the people she had introduced him to, he wouldn't be in jail, leaving her to fend for herself. Rick and Kathy became intimate that night. The next morning, FBI agents stormed Rick's house, arresting both him and Richard. As they spoke with their lawyer, Rick learned he was being charged with possessing drugs with intent to sell. Given that he had over 8 grams, he was facing a possible life sentence. They reached out to FBI agents Alex and Frank, who explained that the FBI would publicly deny any connection with Rick. However, they hinted that they might help reduce his sentence if he agreed to act as an informant one last time. Rick agreed to the plan, involving Kathy in arranging a large drug shipment. The FBI swooped in and arrested everyone involved, dismantling the deal. Unfortunately, the news revealed Rick's involvement on TV, exposing him as the informant, which made him a target. At his trial, the jury found Rick guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. Rick, just 17 years old, was sent to prison. Richard confronted Alex and Frank, but they coldly stated they had never made any promises regarding Rick's future, and that this was the end of the line for him. Dawn and Richard visited Rick in prison, bringing along his daughter, Keisha. Rick asked Dawn to make sure Keisha saw his picture every night so she wouldn't forget him. Richard then spoke to Rick about his case, mentioning that the harsh life sentences for drug crimes might change soon. Rick, however, was deeply saddened, believing his life was over now that he was behind bars. Richard, overcome with emotion, broke down in tears, apologizing for not being able to give Rick the better life he had always wanted for him. After their visit, Rick was led back to his cell, while Richard, Dawn, and little Keisha left to return home.